The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, cheap coffee, and the faint, sad smell of defeat. It was 1972. Another good family was selling out, their dreams laid bare on hay racks for the neighbors to pick over. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jacket, feeling the familiar grit of seed corn under my fingernails. My name is Thomas Miller, and I was there not to gloat, but to watch, to learn. A man can learn a lot at another man's funeral, and a farm auction is the funeral for a way of life. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Jimmy Dale, whose voice could peel paint, was working his way through the household goods. But nobody was really paying attention. All eyes were on the centerpiece, the monster parked by the barn, gleaming like a blood-red idol under the high sun. It was an International Harvester 1460 axial flow combine. Barely 2 years old, with tires that still had the little rubber nubs on them. It was the kind of machine you saw in magazines, not in the dusty fields of Providence County. It had an air-conditioned cab, a stereo, and a grain tank big enough to swallow a small car. It was the reason the Hendersons were finished. The crowd parted as Richard Peterson strutted toward the front. You could call him Rich for short, and he liked it that way. He was my age, 35, but he carried himself like a man who'd already conquered the world. He'd taken over his father's quarter section 5 years ago and, with the bank's money, had turned it into a sprawling empire of 1,000 acres. He wore a crisp seed corn cap that wasn't stained with sweat, and his boots looked like they'd never seen a mud hole. "All right, folks, here she is," Jimmy Dale bellowed, slapping a massive rear tire. "The pride of the IH line. She's got the 16-foot grain head and the 6-row corn head. Low hours, shed kept, and ready to make some money. We all know what happened here, folks. Bill Henderson reached a little too far, but his loss is your gain. Who'll start the bidding for me at $20,000? A low whistle went through the crowd. $20,000 was more than my father paid for our whole farm back in '48. Rich Peterson didn't even flinch. He just raised a single manicured finger. "20, he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the murmurs. Jimmy Dale's eyes lit up. "I got 20,000 from Mr. Peterson. Who'll give me 21? 21,000, boys. This machine will pay for itself in one good season. Look at the price of corn." He was right about that. Corn was pushing $2 a bushel, unheard of money. The papers were full of talk about a big grain deal with the Russians. The banks were practically begging farmers to take out loans, to expand, to buy bigger and better. Get big or get out, that was the new gospel being preached from the co-op to the sale barn. The bidding stalled. No one else had the credit or the nerve. "Sold," Jimmy Dale finally yelled, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot, "for $20,000 to Richard Peterson." A smattering of polite applause broke out. Rich tipped his hat, a king accepting the fealty of his subjects. He turned, and his eyes found mine across the dusty lot. A slow, smug smile spread across his face. He started walking toward me, weaving through the farmers who were now clapping him on the back. I stood my ground next to my old Ford pickup. I hadn't come to buy anything more than a box of mismatched wrenches I'd gotten for $2. My machinery was back at my farm, paid for. My main horse was a John Deere 4020, a '68 model, with more than 6,000 hours on the tack, but an engine that purred like a kitten after the overhaul I'd done last winter. My combine was a John Deere 95 with a simple open station platform and a 4-row corn head. It was slow, it was noisy, and on hot days the dust and chaff would stick to your sweat until you looked like a scarecrow. But it was mine, every last bolt. "Well, well, Miller," Rich said as he stopped in front of me. He smelled of expensive aftershave, a scent as out of place here as a tuxedo. "Enjoying the show? Or are you just here to see what happens to farmers who don't keep up with the times?" "A man's got to know the price of things, Rich," I said, my voice low and even. He chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. "The price of that combine is progress, Tom. It'll cut Henderson's old farm in a day and a half. How long would that take you with that old museum piece you run? A week? 10 days if it doesn't break down?" "It gets the job done," I said, my jaw tightening. "Getting the job done isn't enough anymore. It's about efficiency. Time is money, leverage. These are concepts you just don't seem to understand. he said, tapping his temple with a finger. You're still farming like your old man did, with cash in a coffee can and a fear of the bank. The world's moved on. He gestured back toward the gleaming red machine. That's not just a combine. That's a tool that lets me farm more ground, make more money, and buy out the next guy who can't make his payments. It's a shame, really. You've got some of the best ground in the county, that bottom land your daddy tiled. A man with some vision could do wonders with it. The insult was clear. He was saying I lacked vision, that I was wasting the legacy my father had bled for. I felt a hot spike of anger, but I swallowed it down. Arguing with a man like Rich Peterson was like wrestling a pig in the mud. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. I do all right, I said simply. You do all right, he mocked, while the rest of us are building empires. You mark my words, Tom, in 10 years there'll be two kinds of farmers left. Guys like me and guys who work for guys like me. You better decide which one you want to be. He gave me one last pitying look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into a crowd of admirers. I stood there for a long time, the auctioneer's patter fading into a meaningless drone. The sun beat down on my neck. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me. They'd all heard it. They'd all seen the exchange. In their eyes, Rich was the future, and I was a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to a past that was already gone. Before we go any further, I gotta ask you folks watching this story unfold, thinking back on that time, the early 70s, with land prices booming and the banks handing out money like candy on Halloween, what camp would you have been in? Would you have been like Rich, leveraging every penny to get bigger, faster? Or would you have been like me, sticking to the old ways, trusting only the cash in your hand and the iron you could fix yourself? Drop a comment below and let me know. There's no right or wrong answer, just two different roads that led to two very different places. The harvest of '73 started under a perfect blue sky. The corn stood tall and heavy in the fields, the ears drooping with the weight of their own gold. From my front porch, I could hear the distant, powerful hum of Rich Peterson's new 1460. It was a steady, relentless sound that went from sunup to sundown, and sometimes, under the big yard lights he'd installed, deep into the night. He was cutting a swath through his fields that made my little 4-row head look like a garden toy. My turn came a week later. I'd spent the days before greasing every zerk on my old John Deere 95, checking the belts, sharpening the sickle bars. I topped off the fluids, blew the chaff out of the radiator with the air compressor, and said a little prayer. The first day went off without a hitch. The old girl chugged along, shelling corn clean, the familiar clatter and whine a kind of music to my ears. I was making progress, slow but steady. The second day, disaster struck. I was halfway through a pass on the back 40 when I heard it. A loud metallic bang from the guts of the machine, followed by a violent rhythmic shuddering that shook the whole combine. I slammed the variable speed lever back and shut down the header. The main separator was still running, but it sounded sick. A horrible, grinding, lopsided noise. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the cornstalks. I sat there for a moment, my heart sinking into my boots. I knew that sound. It wasn't a slipped belt or a plugged auger, it was something deep, something broken. I climbed down, grabbing a flashlight even though the sun was still high. Sliding underneath the machine, into the world of grease and dust and shadows, I found the problem. One of the main bearings on the Straw Walker crankshaft had disintegrated. The cast iron housing was cracked, and bits of hardened steel from the bearing cage were embedded in the grease like shrapnel. The crankshaft itself was scored, a deep groove cut into the polished steel where the bearing had failed. I crawled back out, wiping the grease from my hands onto an already filthy rag. I was miles from the workshop, sitting dead in the middle of a 100-acre field with half the crop still on the stalk and the weather forecast calling for rain in 3 days. For a moment I just stood there, looking at the silent, crippled machine. Rich Peterson's words from the auction echoed in my head. 10 days if it doesn't break down. It felt like a curse. I could almost hear the gossip starting at the co-op. Heard Tom Miller's combine blew up. Should have traded that old junker in years ago. But self-pity wouldn't get the corn in. I walked back to the farmhouse, a long, lonely trek through the standing rows. I called the John Deere dealership in town. Straw Walker crankshaft bearing for a 95. The parts man, a kid named Kevin who barely looked old enough to shave, said over the phone, "Yeah, I see it in the book. That's an obsolete part, Mr. Miller. They haven't made those for years. I can try to check the National Parts Locator, but I wouldn't hold my breath." I knew he was right. My combine was a product of the late 1950s. Its parts were sitting in scrapyards, not on dealership shelves. "Thanks, Kevin. Let me know if you find anything." I hung up the phone, the feeling of dread solidifying in my gut. There was only one other option: a full teardown, right here in the field. I'd have to pull the crankshaft, take it to a machine shop in the city to have it turned and polished, and then try to find a new bearing from a specialty supplier that might fit. It would take days, maybe a week. And the rain was coming. I spent the rest of that afternoon and all of the next day doing the dirtiest, most frustrating work a man can do. I built a platform of wooden blocks under the combine to work on. I drained the thick black gear oil. Using a 3/4-inch drive socket set with a long breaker bar, I started loosening the massive bolts that held the Straw Walker assembly in place. They were rusted solid, and I had to soak them in penetrating oil and hammer on the wrench with a 4-pound sledge to break them free. My knuckles were bloody and my back screamed in protest. By sunset on the second day, I had the whole assembly torn apart. The guts of my combine were laid out on a greasy blue tarp. The heavy crankshaft sat on the tailgate of my truck, a wounded piece of steel. The next morning, I drove it to the city. The machinist, an old German man named Klaus, whistled when he saw it. "From the old green machine, yeah? Good steel. Not like the new stuff, but this is a bad one." He ran a caliper over the scored journal. "We will have to turn it down 20 thousandths, maybe 30. Then you need an undersized bearing." "Can you find one?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe. I have a book, big book, full of numbers. I will look." I left the crankshaft with him and drove home feeling hollowed out. That evening, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. I stood in the barn doorway, watching it turn the dust in the driveway to dark mud. Every drop felt like a mockery. Out across the fields, Rich Peterson's land was all stubble. He was done. His grain was safe in the bins, and he was probably sitting in his warm house, counting his money. I hadn't even gotten a quarter of mine out of the field. The community scorn I'd only imagined before now felt real, palpable. I was the fool on the hill, the man who'd let pride and stubbornness lead him to ruin. My father's voice was a whisper in my mind, not angry, but disappointed. "Take care of the land, son, and it will take care of you. But you have to be smart about it." Right then, I didn't feel very smart at all. The years between 1974 and 1979 were a golden age for farmers with nerve and good credit. The grain embargoes were off, the export markets were booming, and the price of corn and soybeans climbed to levels no one had ever dreamed of. Land values doubled, then tripled. A farmer's net worth, on paper at least, could explode overnight. The banks, flush with cash and seeing land as the ultimate can't-lose investment, were lending money at a furious pace. It was a fever, and Rich Peterson had it worse than anyone. He used the soaring value of his initial 1,000 acres as collateral to buy 2,000 more. He bought the old Henderson place, the Schmidt farm when old man Schmidt retired, and the 80 acres of pasture that bordered my property to the east. His operation became a showcase. He put up a massive grain leg and a row of shiny new Butler bins that towered over the landscape. He replaced his 2-year-old IH 1460 with a brand new 1480, an even bigger monster. He traded his tractors in for a fleet of International Harvester 1086 and a massive 4-wheel drive Steiger. They all had air-conditioned cabs, stereos, and tinted glass. His farm looked less like a farm and more like a dealership lot. Rich was the talk of the county. He was featured in the Farm Journal. He was elected to the board at the co-op. He drove a new Lincoln Continental and built a sprawling brick ranch house for his family with a swimming pool in the back. To everyone, he was the embodiment of the new American farmer, a sharp, aggressive businessman who understood that you had to spend money to make money. And I just kept doing what I'd always done. That breakdown in '73 had been a hard lesson. I'd managed to get the combine fixed, losing a week of prime harvest time and a small portion of the crop to the rain, but I got it done. The machinist found the right undersized bearing, and I put it all back together, bolt by painful bolt, my hands covered in grease and anti-seize compound. When the old JD-95 finally roared back to life, the sound was sweeter than any music. The profits from those good years I treated like found money. I didn't see it as an opportunity to expand. I saw it as a chance to armor plate my operation. The first thing I did was pay off the last of the mortgage on my original 240 acres. I'll never forget the day I walked into the bank and handed the check to the loan officer. He looked at me like I had 3 heads. "Tom," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "you know, with your balance sheet and the price of land right now, I could approve you for a loan of $500,000 this afternoon. You could buy that section over by the river, double your acreage." "And double my debt," I replied, sliding the signed papers back to him. "I think I'll just take the deed, thank you." He shook his head, a look of pity on his face. He saw me as a man who was afraid of success. I didn't stop there. I used the cash to systematically improve what I already had. I didn't buy new land, but I put in another 10 miles of tile on the land I owned, improving the drainage on my wettest ground. I didn't buy a new grain system, but I poured a concrete floor in my old wooden corn crib and installed a new drying fan, ensuring the quality of the crop I did harvest. My machinery upgrades were modest and practical. I retired my old Farmall M, the tractor I'd learned to drive on, and replaced it with a used John Deere 4030. It was a good, solid tractor with a sound guard cab that was a luxury compared to my open station 4020, but I found a low-hour model from a retirement auction and paid cash for it. I bought a slightly newer John Deere 6600 combine to replace the old 95. It wasn't the latest and greatest, but it was a step up, a reliable machine that parts were still available for. And again, I paid cash. At the diner where the farmers gathered for coffee every morning, I became a sort of running joke. I was Cash and Carry Miller, the man who was so afraid of a loan payment he was letting the biggest boom in agricultural history pass him by. They'd see Rich Peterson drive by in his new pickup and then look at my 10-year-old Ford, its fenders starting to show the first signs of rust. "Heard Rich closed on the Wilson farm," one would say. "Another 300 acres. Lord, that man must be farming half the county by now. He knows how to use the bank's money," another would add, shooting a glance my way. "Some of us are still stuffing it in a mattress." I never said much. I'd just sip my coffee and listen. They saw my caution as weakness, my discipline as fear. They didn't see the long hours I spent in my shop, rebuilding a planter's row units instead of buying a new one. They didn't see me poring over my account books late at night, making sure every dollar was accounted for, with a growing column of black ink and zero red. In their world of soaring assets and leveraged loans, my simple debt-free balance sheet made me look like a failure. I was standing still while everyone else was sprinting toward a glittering horizon. One evening in the late fall of 1979, I was sitting on my porch, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the stubble fields. The air was crisp and carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. In the distance, I could hear the roar of one of Rich's big Steiger tractors. He was deep ripping his corn stalks, a practice that cost a fortune in diesel but was supposed to boost yields. His lights cut across the darkness, moving relentlessly back and forth. It seemed like his machines never slept. I picked up the latest copy of the Progressive Farmer magazine from the table beside me. I flipped through the articles celebrating the new era of farming, the glossy ads for bigger and bigger equipment. But then a small article tucked away in the back pages caught my eye. It was written by an old economist from Iowa State. He wasn't talking about export markets or land prices. He was talking about something called the prime interest rate. He wrote about inflation, about the Federal Reserve, and about how the cheap money that had fueled the boom couldn't last forever. He used phrases like asset bubble and hard landing. He ended the article with a simple, chilling warning. For a decade, debt has been a farmer's most powerful tool. The day is coming, and it is coming soon, when it will become his heaviest anchor. A cold feeling settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I looked out across the darkness toward the ceaseless roaring lights of Rich Peterson's empire. And for the first time, I felt a tremor in the ground, a deep, unsettling vibration that hinted the whole glittering machine was built on something far less solid than the rich black soil we all stood on. The party was almost over. The bill was about to come due. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet announcement on the radio during the winter of 1980. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. In response, President Carter declared an embargo on grain sales. The news landed like a stone in a still pond. The massive export market that had fueled our prosperity, the very engine of the boom, sputtered and died overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been flirting with $3 a bushel, fell by a third in a matter of weeks. At the diner, the confident talk of expansion vanished, replaced by nervous muttering. Rich Peterson was there, his face tight. "It's political nonsense," he'd said, slamming his coffee cup down. "It'll blow over. The world needs our grain. We just have to hold on." But holding on required cash flow, and for men like Rich, cash flow was a roaring river that had just been dammed. His operating notes were based on $3 corn. His new equipment payments were calculated on it. His entire empire was leveraged against it. Then came the summer. It was a scorcher. The sky turned a hazy metallic blue and stayed that way for weeks. The rain simply stopped. The corn, which had come up so promisingly in the spring, began to suffer. The leaves on my plants curled inward during the day, a thirsty gesture of self-preservation. On Rich's land, it was worse. He'd planted fence row to fence row, pushing the populations higher and higher, demanding more from the soil than it could give, without perfect conditions. His fields were the first to show the pale, sickly yellow of nitrogen stress at the bottom of the stalks. I conserved. I cultivated my rows to break the crust and save what little moisture was there. I ran my tractors at lower RPMs, sipping diesel instead of guzzling it. Every evening I'd check the oil and grease the fittings, treating my paid-for machines like the priceless assets they were. One afternoon I was driving past the edge of Rich's property when I saw it. His massive four-wheel drive Steiger sat silent in the middle of a half-plowed field, its deep ripper shanks buried in the baked earth. It looked like a great green dinosaur that had died mid-stride. A day later, it was still there. I heard at the parts counter that a main hydraulic pump had failed. It wasn't a part you could just pick up. It had to be ordered from the factory in Fargo, and with shipping and the mechanic's time to install the complex high-pressure system, the bill would be close to $5,000. $5,000 for a machine that was just sitting there, burning a hole in his balance sheet while the weeds took over the field. My own crisis came in July. The engine on my John Deere 4430 started running rough. It was a fuel problem. I spent a morning in the shop, not a dealership. I pulled the injectors myself, carefully laying them out on a clean rag on my workbench. I cleaned the tips with a brass brush and disassembled the fuel pump on a hunch. I found it, a tiny pinhole leak in the diaphragm, barely visible to the naked eye, but enough to let it suck a little air and starve the engine under load. A new diaphragm kit from the dealership cost me $12.43. By lunchtime, the 4430 was purring again. The cost of my downtime was a few hours of my own labor and less than $13. I thought of Rich's Steiger, dead in the field, waiting on a $5,000 part, and that economist's article about anchors came back to me. The first real cracks in Rich's empire appeared that fall. The harvest was a bust for everyone. The drought had cut yields in half. We brought in 90-bushel corn instead of 150. But for me, it was a disappointment. For Rich, it was a catastrophe. He had the same massive payments to make, the same colossal fuel and repair bills, but with only half the crop to sell at a depressed price. The talk at the co-op turned to whispers. Rich had been slow to pay his fertilizer bill. The bank manager, a man who used to greet him with a handshake and a smile, was now calling him every other day. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, defensive look. He started parking his Lincoln around the back of the diner as if he didn't want to be seen. He was a man adrift, and he was beginning to realize the tide that had carried him so high was now pulling him out to a cold, deep sea. The ground beneath his feet, the thousands of acres he commanded, was no longer a foundation. It was quicksand. If the grain embargo and the drought were the 1-2 punch, the knockout blow came from a place none of us farmers ever thought to look. Washington, D.C., a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve declared war on inflation, and his only weapon was the interest rate. It was a brutal, blunt instrument. The prime rate, the number that governed all our loans, began to climb. 10%, 12, 15. It kept going, a relentless, horrifying ascent. My operating loan, which I used for seed and fertilizer each spring and paid off every fall, was small. The interest hurt, but it didn't break me. I had no other debt. My land, my house, my machinery, it was all mine. I watched the numbers on the news each night with a knot in my stomach, but it was a knot of anxiety for my neighbors, not of personal terror. For Rich Peterson, it was a death sentence. His loans weren't fixed. They were variable rate, tied to the prime. The $500,000 loan he'd taken out to buy the Wilson farm at 8% was suddenly a 20% loan. His payments didn't just increase, they became monstrous, impossible things. It was like trying to outrun a locomotive. Every month he fell further behind. The interest compounded, feeding on itself, growing larger and more ravenous. The empire began to crumble. First, the bank repossessed the newest equipment. The gleaming 1480 Combine, the Steiger, the fleet of 1086. They sat in a long, sad row behind the dealership, for sale signs taped to their clean cab windows. But nobody was buying. The whole ag economy was seizing up. Then came the foreclosure notices, printed in the fine, dense type of the legal section in the county paper. Peterson Farms, Inc. The list of parcels went on and on. It was a public dismemberment. The land he had fought so hard to acquire was being stripped from him, piece by painful piece. The day of his auction arrived on a cold, blustery morning in November of 1982. It was a ghost of the Henderson auction 10 years earlier. The crowd was bigger, but the mood was funereal. Farmers came from 3 counties, not to find a bargain, but to witness the fall of a giant. It was a cautionary tale played out in real life, and we were all there to learn the lesson. Rich was there with his wife, standing near the brick house he had built. He looked 10 years older. His shoulders were slumped, and the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He wasn't a king anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything. The auctioneer, the same Jimmy Dale, sounded different. His voice lacked its usual snap and swagger. He knew these were his friends and neighbors. He knew he was presiding over a tragedy. The tools and small items sold for pennies. A brand new set of deep well impact sockets, still in the plastic case, went for $20. A heavy-duty welder sold for $100. The market was flooded with the tools of failed farms. Then they got to the land. The banker, a grim-faced man in a suit that looked too thin for the November wind, stood beside Jimmy Dale. They started with the outlying farms, the ones Rich had bought last. A quarter section here, 80 acres there. The bidding was slow, agonizing. Land that had been valued at $2,000 an acre just 3 years before was now struggling to fetch $600. Each crack of the gavel was another nail in Rich's coffin. I stood in the back, just as I had a decade ago, my hands in my pockets, feeling the cold wind cut through my jacket. I wasn't there to gloat. There was no victory in watching a man's dream die. I saw in his ruin the reflection of what could have been my own had I listened to the siren song of easy credit and endless growth. I saw the ghost of my father, and I understood his wisdom in a way I never had before. He hadn't feared debt. He respected it. He knew it was a tool that could turn on its master. As the auctioneer worked his way closer to the home farm, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had survived. My old, slow methods, my caution, my refusal to join the mad rush. It had all been vindicated in the most terrible way possible. While Rich's empire was being sold off to satisfy a distant bank, my little piece of Providence County was secure. My harvest that year was small, and my profits were razor-thin, but the land was mine. The rain would come again. The prices would eventually recover, and I would still be here. I had weathered the storm. The auctioneer's voice cracked with strain as he moved to the final parcels of land. The crowd grew silent, a collective holding of breath. This was the heart of it all. The original Peterson farm, the 160 acres Rich's grandfather had homesteaded and his father had nurtured. It included the brick house, the barns, the swimming pool that was now covered and leaf-strewn. "All right, folks," Jimmy Dale said, his voice softer now. "This is the home quarter. 160 acres, more or less, with improvements. The finest soil in this county. Who'll start the bidding for me? Who'll give me $100,000 for the whole works?" That was $625 an acre. A steal, but the silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The farmers standing around me stared at their boots. They were all broke, or close to it. The men with cash were vultures from out of state, and even they were hesitant, waiting for the price to drop even lower. I saw Rich flinch, his wife turning to bury her face in his shoulder. This was the final humiliation. To have the land his family had bled for, the very ground he'd grown up on, met with dead silence. "Folks, I got to have a bid," Jimmy Dale pleaded. "The bank wants this property sold today." I thought of Rich's words to me all those years ago. "You've got some of the best ground in the county. A man with some vision could do wonders with it." He'd been talking about my father's land then. Now his father's land was on the block. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. I thought of the good years, the cash I had carefully saved, sitting in conservative certificates of deposit at that very same bank. It wasn't a fortune, but it was solid. It was real. I raised my hand. Not high, just a simple, clear gesture. 100,000, I said. My voice sounded loud in the stillness. Every head turned toward me. I saw surprise, confusion, and in a few faces a dawning respect. The banker's eyes widened. Rich looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. Jimmy Dale's professional instincts kicked back in. "I got 100,000 from Tom Miller. Who'll give 105? 105,000. A man in a clean Stetson hat, one of the out-of-state buyers, nodded. 105. 110, I said immediately, my voice firm. I didn't look at him. I looked at the auctioneer. The man in the Stetson conferred with his partner. He was a bottom feeder, looking for a fire sale price. He wasn't expecting a fight from a local in a worn work coat. 112.5, he countered. 120, I said, without hesitation. $75,000 above my opening bid was my limit. It was a fair price, not a predatory one. The man in the Stetson shook his head and waved his hand dismissively at the auctioneer. He was out. Jimmy Dale scanned the crowd, his eyes lingering for a moment on mine. He saw no gloating, no triumph. $120,000, he called out. Going once, going twice, sold. For $120,000 to Thomas Miller. The gavel fell. The sound was dull, final. A murmur went through the crowd. Cash and Carrie Miller had just bought the Peterson place. I didn't join the line to sign the paperwork right away. Instead, I walked across the frozen yard, my boots crunching on the dead grass. I walked toward Rich. He stood alone now, his wife having gone inside the house. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable. He expected me to gloat, to say, "I told you so." To remind him of his arrogance at the Henderson auction. He expected me to be the victor claiming his spoils. I stopped a few feet from him. "Rich," I said quietly. He just nodded, unable to speak. "I didn't buy this place to kick you out," I said. "I bought it to keep it from being carved up by some corporation from Chicago. It's Peterson land. It should be farmed by a Peterson." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a confusion that slowly gave way to a flicker of understanding. "I want you to stay," I continued. "Stay in your house. Farm this quarter. I'll rent it to you on a crop share basis. A fair one. 60-40, your favor, until you get back on your feet. You're a good farmer, Rich. You just got caught in a bad time." For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind whipped around us, carrying the scent of impending snow. A tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. "Why, Tom?" he finally choked out. "After everything I said to you. Why?" I looked past him, at the old barn his grandfather had built, its paint peeling, but its frame still true. I thought of my own father and the community of neighbors who had helped him raise that same barn after a fire in '52. We were all bound together by the soil, by the weather, by the shared struggle. Because that's what neighbors do, I said. Years passed. The farm crisis of the 80s slowly loosened its grip. The rain returned, and prices began a slow, unsteady climb back toward profitability. The landscape of Providence County was changed forever. Half the farms were gone, consolidated into larger operations owned by distant holding companies. But here and there, the old names remained. Rich Peterson farmed his home quarter, and he farmed it well. He was a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He sold the Lincoln and drove an old Chevy pickup. He did his own repairs. We never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between us. Every fall, we'd help each other finish the harvest. My John Deere working alongside the older, smaller International tractor he'd managed to buy. My own farm remained the same size, but it was prosperous, secure. I passed the wisdom of my father, filtered through my own hard experience, down to my son, Mark. He grew up in the shop, with the smell of grease and steel in his nostrils. One afternoon, when he was a teenager, he was helping me replace the sickle sections on the combine's grain head. "Dad," he asked, tightening a nut, "why didn't you ever get bigger? After the crisis, you could have bought land for next to nothing. You could have an operation as big as anyone's." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. I wiped my hands on a red rag and pointed to the deed box in my office. "In that box is the deed to this land. It has my name on it. Not my name and the bank's. That's the most important thing. This isn't about being the biggest, son. It's about being here tomorrow. It's about leaving this ground better than we found it. We don't own it, not really. We're just caretakers for a little while." I picked up another sickle section. Debt makes a man bold, but it can also make him a fool. It makes him plant fence row to fence row, pushing the land too hard. It makes him buy a new machine when the old one just needs a $12 part. Remember this: never, ever bet the farm, because it's not just your farm you're betting. It's your grandpa's, and it's yours, and God willing, it'll be your kids someday too. Now I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled and my back aches on cold mornings. Mark runs the farm and he runs it well. He uses computers to track yields and markets, but he still does his own repairs, and he pays for his equipment with cash. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit on the porch, the same porch my father sat on, and I look out over the fields. The land is dark and peaceful under the setting sun. In the distance, I can see the lights of the Peterson place, where Rich's son now farms alongside him. The monstrous red combine that started it all is long gone, a relic of a frantic, feverish time. It was sold for scrap, its promise of easy wealth turned to rust. It turns out Rich was right about one thing all those years ago. In the end, there were two types of farmers left. But they weren't the big and the small. They were the ones who remembered that the land is a partner to be respected, not a resource to be conquered. And they were the ones who were gone. The harvest of those bitter years taught us a lesson that couldn't be found in a magazine or a bank's loan portfolio. It taught us that the heaviest loads are not the ones you haul in the grain cart, but the ones you carry on the books, and that the true measure of a man's wealth is not the number of acres he controls, but the freedom he feels when he stands on the acres that he truly owns.